the Property Rights of Spouses Act. This is the law that outlines how the court is going to divide your property between you and your spouse when your marriage comes to an end. This law also applies if you are not married but have been living together for more than 5 years. In this playlist, I read the entire Property Rights of Spouses Act. You'll find in other playlists where I read detailed records of some divorce cases from the Supreme Court Library. So those cases, they show the background to the case, the submission of evidence by the lawyers for each spouse, the legal analysis of the evidence presented, and the judge's discussion of the facts of the case and the judge's ruling. Now, getting married is a major life decision, and we need to know the legal implications of what we are getting ourselves into when we make such a decision. Now, I want you to subscribe to this channel, then read with me, study, and discuss with me the laws and the cases. Now, from reading the cases, I learned that the properties that the court can divide or can decide on include any property that you and your spouse decide to fight over in court. These include the family home, lands, bank accounts, motor vehicles, stocks, company shares, and other properties. I will just highlight a few of the main parts of the Property Rights of Spouses Act here. Section 6 of this Act says that each spouse shall be entitled to 1/2 share of the family home. And this is done when the court dissolves your marriage by granting a decree of dissolution of your marriage, or upon termination of cohabitation between you and your spouse if you were not married. This is also done when the court gives you a document called a decree of nullity of your marriage. It declares your marriage null and void. Or even if you have not yet fully divorced each other, it can do so when a husband and wife have separated and there is no likelihood of reconciliation. And the Act also states that you should apply for division of property within 12 months of separation or divorce, within 12 months. Although the court can consider a longer period of time depending on the circumstances of your particular case. Now, the general pattern of ruling by the judge regarding the family home is that the spouses must agree on a real estate valuator to value the family home, right? But if they cannot agree on a valuator, then the court will appoint its own valuator. After they receive valuation of the property to say how much the property would cost if it is sold, one spouse has the option of buying out the other spouse's 50% share in the property within a certain period of time. I've seen 30 days in the rulings that I've read, right? Now, if you are given the option of buying out your spouse's 50% share within 30 days and you cannot afford to do that, or you're not willing to do that, then the court says that the house should be put up for sale by private treaty or on the open market, right? And then after the house is sold, the money from that sale is to be divided equally between the two spouses. Now, this 50-50 division is called the equal share rule, and it is the norm. However, Section 7 provides for variation of the equal share rule. However, note that the onus is on the spouse who does not want it to be shared 50-50. Right? If you think that your spouse is not entitled to any shares in the family home, or is entitled to less than 50% share in the family home, then the onus is on you to prove why the court should depart from the 50-50 rule. Right? So the main reasons why the court might depart from the 50-50 rule is also in the Property Rights of Spouses Act. It says one is if the house was inherited by one spouse. So, for example, you inherited the house. It was passed down to you from older relatives. Or it could be that one spouse owned the house before the marriage took place. And also, if the marriage was of a short duration. Now, the Property Rights of Spouses Act does not outline or does not state how many weeks or months or years should be considered as short duration, but the judges present their own opinions as to what short duration is. And you will find that in later cases, other judges might refer to previous rulings. In a divorce case that I've read and recorded, the judge referred to a previous case, a previous ruling, where that judge considered 2 years as short duration. But in the particular case which I read, it was much shorter. In fact, that case was Hall versus Hall, Mr. and Mrs. Hall, right? In that case, the wife, who was a hairdresser, got married to her husband, an accountant. He took her into his house. He owned the house for 15 years before he married her, right? Took her into his house along with her child, her little daughter, who she had with another man before from her previous marriage. Now, shortly after that, as they would say, all hell broke loose in that house. There was constant fights. There were constant fights and arguments over money. And he, Mr. Hall, earned substantially more money than Mrs. Hall. So it would be over his money, right? Over his money and the child. Now, Mr. Hall's mother had lived in that house with him previously and lived in peace. But she had to move out of the house to get some peace and quiet. And that happened 3 months after she moved in, after Mrs. Hall moved in. Then Mr. Hall moved out of the matrimonial bedroom shortly after and started sleeping in the room that his mother had occupied before. All within 3 months, And the wife finally left his apartment with her daughter 1 month after. That's a total of 4 months of marriage. 4 months of a short, bitter, miserable marriage. But then, Mrs. Hall applied to the court to take half of Mr. Hall's house and for him to pay her spousal support and child support for the child. Well, of course, the court found that ridiculous. What the court ordered was $50,000 spousal support for 1 year. Right? It said that Mrs. Hall had said she contributed $30,000 throughout the marriage to household expenses, but that was only 4 months. $30,000 per month. That was only 4 months. That would be what? 4 trees, $120,000. But Mr. Hall spent most of the money in the house. But yet the judge rewarded her spousal support of $50,000 per month for 1 year, stating that it should help her in enrolling in a course of study so that she could become self-sufficient after, right? But anyway, back to the Property Rights of Spouses Act. Now, in considering your spouse's interest in the house, the judge will consider any money that your spouse had contributed towards the building of the house and the maintenance of the house. But the judge also considers household duties, household chores, right? And convert those things to interest in the family home. Now, I've seen where in some cases the lawyers argued for part of the spousal support to be paid, to be for that spouse to continue to enjoy the standard of living that they had enjoyed during the marriage, right? So, here, if you are the main breadwinner, you made substantially more than your spouse. You have been supporting your spouse, making your spouse enjoy a certain standard of living throughout the marriage. Then you have to, after you divorce and your spouse leaves you, you have to pay to ensure that they continue enjoying that standard of living. Now, it's not for life. There was one ruling in which the judge said that in these modern days, it is unjust to have a spouse provide spousal support for another spouse for life, right? They can be sufficient after a while. But in terms of standard of living, when it comes to paying for standard of living, is not for life. The argument is that usually that you have to pay for her to continue to enjoy the standard of living that you made her accustomed to during the marriage. Well, I said her because the thing is, it's usually the husband who is made to pay the spousal support and this portion of the spousal support to his wife, right? Even though the act is gender neutral on the face of it, it's mostly men who are at risk of having to pay these support. And this is there are reasons. For example, you have the traditional view of persons, right, contributing to it, even lawyers and judges. And also, the fact is that men tend to marry across and down social hierarchies of wealth, and power, and professional position in society, while women tend to marry across and up. In other words, a man is willing to marry a woman who makes or who earns substantially less money than he does. But a woman is not willing to marry a man who makes substantially less money than she does. She wants to marry up. She wants to marry a man who makes substantially more money than she does. Right? So the man tends to be the one having to pay this support to his wife or his ex-wife. Now, here, talking about having to pay spousal support, I recall a certain case, Sinclair versus Sinclair, where the wife was an accountant and she did not work very much during the marriage. She did not work for most of the marriage. Right? In fact, they were married for more than 30 years. And I think she worked for about 2 years outside the home. But her husband was a medical doctor. Right? And businessman, very successful businessman. Now she applied for $835,000 per month in spousal support. Now remember, the children had grown up, The children of the marriage had grown up and had moved out of the house by now. And by the way, Dr. Sinclair had fathered 9 children. One of them was less than a year old. Dr. Sinclair was in his early 60s, while Mrs. Sinclair was in her late 50s. He fathered only 2 of those 9 children with her. Right? And it seemed as if he fathered 7 children during the marriage. So I guess that's what persons would call a stud and a playboy. Right? But the thing is, their children that they had together were already adults, right? It was her alone that would be left there to support, for him to support, but she wanted $835,000 per month in spousal support, including $60,000 per month for gas, right? Gasoline for the car. A whopping $60,000 per month. I don't know what type of vehicle she had and how far she would be driving. $40,000 per month for entertainment. $40,000 per month for hairdresser. $15,000 per month for manicure and pedicure. $20,000 for facial. Well, that's certainly a high maintenance woman. And of course, she has to eat. So she applied for $200,000 per month for her groceries. Right. But anyway, what a case that was. And in that case, remember that the properties included a house in Cherry Gardens, Kingston, with a pool. I think there were, 4 high-end motor vehicles or something like that, and millions of dollars in bank account and company shares and so on and so forth. That was really a high profile divorce case, right? But the fact is, you have to be very careful with this thing, this marriage thing. You can lose your money, you can lose your property, you can lose your sanity, your mental health. So you have to be very careful, right? Now, the thing is, it's really heartbreaking to see two people who met and fell in love. They celebrated their union in the form of a wedding in the presence of family and friends. Then later they find themselves in front of a judge in court in a bitter divorce and legal battle, fighting over property. Who should get what and who should not get what, right? Throwing accusations one against the other. It's really sad, really heartbreaking. And to think of it, the thing is, is not the case that on the one side there are these marriages that end in divorce and they're unhappy. They were unhappy, that's why they ended in divorce. But all these other marriages on the other side, they have not ended in divorce because the spouses are happy with each other and enjoying the marriage. That's not so, right? I believe for every marriage that ends in divorce, there are probably 2 or 3 that are almost brushing up against the divorce line. And it will take just one more straw to break the camel's back to push them over that line into divorce territory. And then there are, for each of those, maybe another 2 or 3 that are very, very close. Not as close, but very close to the divorce line, right? Very unhappy marriages. But they probably stayed together because in the interest of the children, maybe the embarrassment of having a divorce, right? Knowing that friends and relatives and colleagues and your church brothers and church sisters will know, so they therefore stick it out and suffer instead of divorcing. Can't be bothered with the back and forth in court and so on, right? And the divorce rate is very high. I read in the media about the very high divorce rate, bogging down the courts, overwhelming the courts, right? Many divorces occurring. Really sad. But the fact is that marriage is hard work. It's not like in the fairy tales where you have the prince and princess, they go off to live happily ever after. It's not that. It's hard work. It's about duty and sacrifice, right? Now the thing is, I disclaimer here, I'm not a trained attorney at law. But the fact is, we need to know our legal rights, our legal obligations, and the legal risks of our decision. Alright? So, check out the other acts that I've read in addition to this. And if you have a particular case, you're in a situation that might lead to you having to see a lawyer, right? And probably having to go into court at some point. You should empower yourself by reading the acts, reading previous cases to gain some amount of knowledge beforehand. Alright? So, anyway, that will be it for now. So, thank you for listening.